"She's doing it again," someone whispered just loud enough for others to hear as they passed by. Head down, hands clasped, the woman didn't flinch. It was the third time that week. Same corner of the break room, same quiet worship music slipping through her earbuds, same bowed posture at the edge of her desk, while the rest of the office pretended not to notice, but always noticed. "She's trying to be holy," one coworker sneered from behind the vending machine. Another snapped a picture. Someone laughed. Someone uploaded it. The caption was short, sharp, smug. Saint Sarah doing her thing again. But what none of them knew, what not a single eye-rolling coworker or comment-liking follower had even imagined, was that every name mocking her was already written down in her journal. Not to expose, not to shame, but to pray. Because she wasn't just worshiping, she was interceding quietly, faithfully, relentlessly every lunchtime. And when she finally stood up, calmly closed her Bible, tucked her journal beneath her arm, and spoke one single sentence to the room, the entire break room went silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from guilt, but from conviction. The kind that doesn't need a microphone, because the weight of it hits the heart directly. So what did she say? And why did that one sentence begin a ripple effect no one saw coming? Before we reveal how one woman's quiet worship broke an entire office's pride, make sure you're subscribed to Plead the Word and let us know in the comments. Have you ever been mocked for your faith? She didn't have to do it here. No one asked her to bring worship into the office. There was no rule book that said prayer belonged in the break room, no memo that gave her permission, no sign that reserved a corner table for someone with a Bible in one hand and a journal in the other. But still, every day at exactly 12:15 p.m., Sarah pulled her chair into the far end of the staff lounge. Same chair, same time, same posture, headphones in, hands folded, eyes closed. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was for peace, for quiet, for the one part of her day that felt untouched by deadlines, emails, or the passive-aggressive tension that hung in the air like stale coffee. This wasn't loud worship. No raised hands, no out-loud singing, not even a whisper of lyrics, just a faint hum, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were listening for heaven. And most people weren't. It had started as a promise, a private vow made at her father's funeral. One she whispered through tears and trembling lips. 15 minutes a day, Lord. No matter where I am, I'll give them to you. And so she did. At home, on the bus, in waiting rooms, and now, here, in the most ordinary place imaginable, surrounded by vending machines and half-hearted chatter about weekend plans. At first, nobody noticed. She looked like she was meditating or maybe just tired, and in an office this overstimulated tiredness was invisible. But by the second week, a few coworkers started whispering. By the third, the jokes began. Someone muttered, "She's doing her holy thing again," while reaching for creamer. Another walked by humming a gospel tune off-key, elbowing a friend. The mockery wasn't loud, not yet, but it was there like a low hum underneath the buzz of the refrigerator. Sarah said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't open her eyes. Because while they whispered about her, she was whispering their names, one by one, silently, intentionally. The names of those same coworkers scribbled carefully into the worn pages of the brown journal tucked beneath her Bible. They didn't know that they wouldn't have understood if they did. But in a few days, everything would change. For now, though, they laughed, and she worshipped. And each day, the laughter got just a little louder. It started with whispers behind mugs and snickers from across the room, but soon it turned into chuckles that didn't bother to hide. Someone took a picture of her once, quietly, with the sound off, and added a caption before hitting send in the group chat. Caught in the act, Saint Sarah saving souls at the Keurig. The likes rolled in. Emojis, laughter. A few people looked up from their phones just to see if she'd noticed. She hadn't, or maybe she had, and just chose not to let it matter. By the end of the week, the tension in the room had shaped. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was an atmosphere. The kind that clings to walls and lingers between words. Carla, who sat 2 desks down from Sarah, started timing her entrance to the lounge, just to make sure she'd be there when it happened. She'd bring her lunch, sit close, and sigh loudly while scrolling her phone. "Here we go again," she'd mumble, not even trying to be subtle. Kevin once brought in a Bluetooth speaker and started playing a rap song loud enough to cut through the quiet. "Hope the Lord doesn't mind a beat," he said with a grin, staring right at her. Still, she didn't open her eyes. What none of them realized was that Sarah had already written all their names down, not out of spite, not to remember the pain, but to carry it. Each day after lunch, she would return to her desk, slide open the bottom drawer, pull out her journal, and write. Not what they did, but how she prayed for them. Peace over Kevin. Softness for Carla's heart. Joy for Mel. She looked sad behind her smile. There were scriptures scribbled next to names, dates marked like milestones, and sometimes even tears smudged across the ink. This wasn't just worship, it was war. A quiet kind of warfare that didn't swing back with sarcasm, but with intercession. But the others didn't know that. All they saw was a woman who wouldn't break. A quiet figure in the corner who kept showing up, kept bowing her head, kept acting like heaven belonged in a room where no one had asked for it. And something about that bothered them more than they'd admit. Then came Thursday. It started like every other day. Sarah arrived at 12:14, placed her thermos on the table, pulled out her Bible and her journal, and sat down. By 12:16, the snickers had already started. Someone crumpled a receipt into a ball and tossed it toward her. It landed just shy of her elbow. She didn't move. Carla laughed. Kevin leaned back in his chair and called out, "Hey Sarah, tell God I said what's up." More laughter. Someone else added, "Ask him if he's hiring. I need a raise." The room echoed with amusement, and still she sat, headphones in, eyes closed. She was humming softly, barely, but to her that hum was sacred. Carla pulled out her phone and hit record. "You guys gotta see this," she whispered to the camera. "Every day, like a clock." Someone whispered, "Sing to the ceiling, girl." Another voice joined in, this time louder. "Where's your God now?" And that's when Sarah opened her eyes. Just like that. Calm, quiet, no rush, no drama. She opened her eyes, took a breath, reached forward, and gently closed her Bible. The laughter continued. But something in the room shifted. Just slightly. Enough to make Mel, the one always laughing the loudest, pause for a second and glance away. Sarah placed her Bible down beside her journal. Her fingers rested on the cover for a moment, as if steadying something inside her. Then she stood up. Not quickly. Not defensively. Just deliberately. The kind of movement that silences a room, not because it demands attention, but because it carries weight. The laughter stalled. Carla lowered her phone a few inches, as if unsure whether to keep recording. Kevin raised an eyebrow, the smirk on his face faltering slightly. Sarah didn't look angry. She didn't look upset. She just looked steady, like someone who had already decided long before this moment how she would carry it. She glanced around the room, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet knowing. Eyes met hers, then darted away. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One guy cleared his throat and looked down at his sandwich. And then, with a voice just loud enough to carry, clear enough to slice through the tension, and soft enough to make you lean in, she spoke. "I've prayed for each of you by name." That was it. 7 words. No scripture, no lecture, no tears. Just truth. It landed like thunder in a room that suddenly had no noise. Carla froze mid-blink. Kevin's smirk disappeared completely. The woman by the window quietly set down her fork. You could hear the humming of the vending machine, the tick of the clock. Mel looked like she'd seen a ghost. Sarah didn't add anything else. She didn't wait for a response. She reached down, picked up her Bible and journal, placed her thermos gently back into her tote, and walked out. The silence stretched long after the door clicked shut behind her. One woman got up and left the room entirely. Another kept staring at her phone, not really seeing it. Carla looked down at her hands, and for the first time in weeks, didn't have anything to say. Kevin stood up to grab a napkin, but didn't come back. And then, quietly, from the back corner of the room, someone asked, "How did she know?" Nobody answered. They wouldn't know for days that Sarah had been writing down their names, one by one, with scriptures beside them and prayer requests she wasn't even supposed to know. They wouldn't know that the same woman they laughed at had been interceding for their marriages, their children, their anxiety, and the job interviews they never mentioned out loud. They wouldn't know that someone had seen them, not with judgment, but with love. But for now, they just sat there, in the quiet, and slowly, one by one, they started to feel it. Conviction. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't come from being corrected, but from being seen. But that moment, that silence, wasn't where it started for Sarah. It started in a hospital room. Fluorescent lights, beeping monitors, the kind of sterile quiet that makes every sound feel intrusive. She had been sitting beside her father's bed for 8 days straight, sleeping in the same blue hoodie, barely eating, humming the same hymn over and over again. Her father, once strong, once full of laughter and loud prayers and Sunday morning pancakes, now lay still, his hands cold, his breathing shallow. The doctors said it could be hours, or days. They didn't know. Sarah did, not because of science, but because she had prayed. And in the stillness of one of those nights, when she was alone with him and the nurse had stepped out, she felt it. A presence, not loud, not emotional, just near. She opened her eyes and looked at her father's face. He was still breathing, but the fight was almost over. She reached for his hand and whispered something no one else heard. "I'll keep the fire burning, Dad." That was the last thing she ever said to him. Not goodbye, not "I love you," but a promise. Because when she was a little girl, he'd told her something she never forgot. Even when the church forgets, even when the world gets loud, worship keeps the oil burning. She didn't fully understand it back then, but now she did. So she made a vow that night, right there in that stiff hospital chair with the plastic cushion and the old Bible in her lap, 15 minutes a day, anywhere, everywhere, no matter who's watching or who isn't. A pocket of time set aside for worship, not for blessing, not for asking, just for him. That was 4 months ago, and she hadn't missed a day, even on the days she cried through it, even on the days the world felt numb, even when the office made her feel small. Especially then, it wasn't discipline, it wasn't tradition, it was survival. Because in the absence of her father's voice, that worship became her anchor. Her way of remembering who she was. Every hum was a prayer, every silence was a psalm. Every moment of stillness in the break room was a conversation with the only one who never misunderstood her. And that's why, when they laughed, she didn't stop. Because they weren't laughing at her. Not really. They were laughing at what they didn't understand. But she understood. She remembered. And to her, that was enough. She remembered a morning when the pews were still empty, before the choir warmed up, before the pastor even arrived. She was 7. Her legs barely touched the floor as she swung them under the wooden church bench, waiting for her father to finish setting up the pulpit. The sanctuary smelled like old wood and hymnals. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the stained glass windows caught just enough light to cast reds and blues across the floor. Her father was humming. Not a full song, just a phrase, over and over. "You are worthy, O Lord." Then he stopped and looked at her. "You know," he said, "worship isn't just singing, it's presence, stillness. It's saying to God, 'I'm here, and you matter.' That's more than most people ever say to him." He winked and went back to tuning the mic, but she never forgot those words. Years later, in a break room that never had stained glass, on a plastic chair that never smelled like hymnals, she said them again, not with her lips, but with her stillness. "I'm here, and you matter." That's what they didn't see. That's what they couldn't mock. Because worship like that doesn't ask to be understood. It just burns, quietly, faithfully, unmoved. And somewhere, if she listened closely enough, just past the noise of vending machines and snickering coworkers, she could still hear his voice humming, "You are worthy, O Lord." But the noise was getting harder to tune out. Laughter had a way of creeping closer, testing the boundary between annoyance and attack. At first it was nothing, just a smirk across the table. A whisper passed like a secret, a glance. Then the phones came out. No one asked permission. They just recorded. A 10-second clip here, a caption there. Our very own office chaplain. One girl nudged her friend and mouthed, "Hallelujah," with a mocking hand raised in the air. It was subtle, just enough to get a laugh but not enough to get called out. Sarah sat still, her head bowed, her eyes closed, her hands resting quietly in her lap, journal open to a page full of names. She could feel them watching. She could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was spectacle. Kevin leaned against the counter, sipping his drink like it was a show. "She humming again?" He asked no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She gotta be summoning something. That coffee machine about to catch the Holy Ghost." They laughed harder this time. Someone added sound effects to the clip and posted it to their story. Another person zoomed in on her face and typed, "Blessings be upon thee." The video spread faster than gossip ever did. A few people from other departments started wandering into the lounge around lunchtime, not for food, but to see it for themselves. The girl in the corner, the one who worshipped like nobody else was there. And Sarah, she knew. She always knew. But she stayed. Because it was never about them. She had written each of their names that morning. Not in anger, not for revenge. She wrote them beside scriptures, words of life beside the ones who laughed at it. Not everyone had a verse yet. Some were still blank, but she believed they would have one, eventually. The hardest part wasn't the laughter. It was knowing she was praying for the very people who made her worship feel foolish. But she kept coming back, because the vow she made didn't come with conditions. The vow wasn't if they're kind or if they understand. The vow was 15 minutes a day, wherever she was, no matter what. And so she showed up, even when the videos started gaining traction, even when someone forwarded her the clip and said, "Girl, they really doing you like this?" Even when the comments said things like, "She's possessed," and "Who even brings God to work?" Even when a manager gently suggested she consider moving to another break room, just to keep the peace, she smiled, nodded, and stayed, not defiantly, just faithfully. Because peace isn't always quiet. Sometimes it hums in corners, sometimes it prays in silence, sometimes it's mocked before it's understood, and sometimes it's not understood until it breaks something open. Sarah didn't know it yet, but the ripple had already started. The mocking wasn't the real story. The real story was what happened after. But first, they had to hear the sentence, the one she hadn't planned to say, but the Spirit had already written. Sarah placed her Bible down beside her journal. Her fingers lingered on the cover for a moment, as if steadying something inside her. Then she stood up. The room wasn't ready for it. Conversations kept going. Someone opened a can. Someone else scrolled through a video. A bag of chips crinkled too loud. A laugh cut across the room like static. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply looked up and spoke. I've prayed for each of you by name." The sentence landed like silence dropped in water. Not a crash, not a boom, just stillness. Every sound in the room seemed to fade at once. The laughter died in mid-breath. No one spoke, no one moved. Carla blinked too fast. Kevin looked away. Mel reached for her phone, then stopped. The weight of the sentence sat on their chests like something they didn't know they were carrying. Because suddenly, they weren't laughing at the weird girl in the corner. They were standing in the presence of someone who had been standing in the gap for them, who knew their names, who had brought them one by one before a God they didn't believe in, but suddenly couldn't ignore. The room didn't feel like a break room anymore. It felt like something holy had passed through, and they couldn't name it, but they felt it. That's what conviction is. Not shame, not punishment. Just that quiet echo inside your chest that whispers, "You've been seen and loved anyway." Sarah didn't say anything else. She picked up her Bible, tucked her journal under her arm, and walked out. Not dramatically, just gracefully, like someone who knew her job was done for the day. But heaven wasn't finished. Not yet. The next day came like any other. Fluorescent lights, lukewarm coffee, that same soft rumble of vending machines and coworker chatter. But inside the break room, something felt different. It wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. When Sarah walked in, she didn't expect anything to be different. She hadn't rehearsed an entrance. She wasn't looking for apologies. But the moment her shoes crossed the threshold, the air told a different story. No one said her name. No one stared. But the laughter, that sharp, echoing laughter that once greeted her every afternoon, was gone. Carla, who had always made the first joke, was quiet this time, eyes fixed on her phone, but not scrolling. Kevin looked up from the corner, met Sarah's gaze for the briefest second, and then lowered his head like someone who had seen something sacred and didn't know how to explain it. Sarah didn't react. She walked the same path, sat in the same chair, pulled her Bible from her bag with the same steady grace as the day before. Her journal followed. Familiar pages, familiar pen. She opened to a fresh page and began to write, but she wasn't alone. Jerome, the IT guy who rarely left his cubicle, stepped in just after her. He didn't say much, just nodded toward the empty seat across from her. Then, without asking, he pulled it out and sat down. Not in reverence, not in mockery, just present. He didn't bow his head, didn't pretend to understand. But he stayed, and somehow that said more than words could. Sarah glanced up once, then back down to her page. She didn't need to speak. This wasn't a show. She wasn't trying to win them. She was still just worshiping. Only now, something else had begun. The door opened again. Carla stepped in. Her laughter wasn't there to carry her this time. She looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence, like something had been peeled back. She didn't sit, but she didn't leave either. She stood near the coffee maker, fidgeting with the sugar packets, watching, listening. Across the room, Kevin lingered longer than usual. When he finally did leave, he glanced back once, just once. Sarah kept writing. She didn't know what to make of it. She wasn't measuring the moment. But in her journal, under yesterday's entry, she quietly added 4 more names. No dates, no notes, just names, and beside them, a single word, waiting. Because sometimes the real miracles aren't loud. They begin with the softest cracks, the kind of shifts only heaven celebrates, the kind that make angels lean in and say, something just moved. And Sarah, she just kept showing up, not for them, not for validation, but because she made a promise to worship God, even in places that didn't ask for it. And somehow, those places had started to change. Sarah kept showing up. She didn't change her routine, didn't bring more attention to herself, didn't soften the worship or adjust the ritual. She just came, every day, same time, same seat, same quiet reverence. And somehow, everything around her kept changing. The laughter that once echoed off the lounge walls had dulled into something quieter. Awkward glances, unfinished jokes, silent nods. No one announced it, but people began arriving early just to be in the room before her. Not to join her, just to see, to witness, to understand, maybe. She never invited them. She never even looked around, but day after day, a few more stayed, sat longer, talked less. The chair across from her, once untouched, was now rarely empty. One day it was Jerome, tapping his foot nervously as he sat. Another day, it was Carla, half pretending to scroll through her phone but never really scrolling at all. No one admitted it out loud, but the air was different when she worshipped. Softer, heavier, sacred, as if something invisible had walked in with her and refused to leave. Someone left a sticky note once, folded in half beside her journal. It didn't say much, just, "Thank you." No signature, no explanation. But Sarah tucked it into the back of her Bible like a relic. Another day, a paper napkin slid under her bag while she wasn't looking. When she opened it later, the words were scribbled and shaky. "Please pray for my mom." Stage 4. She didn't cry. She just turned the page in her journal and wrote the woman's name beneath a verse from Psalm 41. The Lord sustains them on their sickbed and restores them from their bed of illness. She didn't tell anyone. She just added the name to the list. By the end of that week, her journal held names of people she'd never spoken to, people who once mocked her, people who now waited quietly for her to arrive. No one had repented in a grand, cinematic way. There were no altar calls in the staff lounge. But there was reverence now. There was respect. There was space. And in the heavenlies, where prayers echo louder than words, something had shifted. Sarah didn't need a platform. She didn't need a mic. She had a promise, a vow made in grief, a worship that cost her nothing and everything. She showed up. She opened her Bible. She closed her eyes. And God did the rest. It wasn't a revival. There were no spotlights, no worship bands, no testimonies posted online. Just a woman, a corner, and a journal full of names. That was the sanctuary. And day by day, as the seasons turned, her presence stayed. Even when the room changed. Even when they didn't always understand what she carried. They knew it was holy. Some still laughed. Not everyone changes. But even they lowered their voices when she walked in. Not out of fear, but out of something closer to awe. Because Sarah had become more than just the praying girl. She was the reminder that faith doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, that obedience can whisper and still shake walls, that sometimes the greatest sermons are lived in silence. And in that silence, lives were being written. One afternoon, a new staff member asked where she always sat. No one had a name for the spot, but they all knew it. They just called it her corner, as if the presence she left behind still lingered. And maybe it did. Maybe heaven still passed through at 12:15 p.m., where the hum of vending machines met the sound of intercession. Maybe someone still sits there, not knowing why, only that it feels peaceful. And maybe, just maybe, that's how God moves most of the time. Not in thunder, not in fire, but in the still small things. The hidden yes, the folded hands, the one who worships when no one claps. Because faith like that doesn't need to be seen. It just needs to be true. And somewhere, in that small corner, it still is.